On a mist-shrouded morning, a convoy of unmarked vehicles glided through the wrought-iron gates of a Dorset estate known more for its secrecy than its beauty. This was not a social call. Inside the main house, Camilla Rosemont, a socialite of fading grandeur but undiminished cunning, watched from her window, her hand instinctively closing around a velvet pouch hidden in her dressing gown. For over a decade, a dazzling secret had slept within these walls, a cache of jewels personally gifted by a beloved, late queen to a confidant, never meant for the public eye, and declared lost to history. Today, the royal guard had come to take them back. But the stones, like the truths surrounding them, had sharp edges that cut both ways. This is the story of that raid, a tale not of simple theft and recovery, but of hidden loyalties, a lifetime of regret, and the profound weight of a promise made between two women, one a monarch, the other her silent keeper. Document 1. The dawn was a pale, watery gray over the Dorset countryside, the kind of light that seemed to leach color from the world. Nestled in a shallow valley, the Rosemont estate stood sentinel, its Georgian facade handsome but wearing a faint air of neglect, like a once grand dame who had stopped trying. The mist clung to the boxwood hedges and curled around the stone griffins flanking the main entrance. At precisely 6:03 a.m., the silence was fractured by the soft crunch of tires on gravel. Not the roar of sirens, but the purposeful, efficient hum of modern engines. 7 vehicles, dark and sleek, formed a discreet cordon around the circular driveway. From them emerged men and women in dark suits, their bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothing. They were members of the Royal Guard's Specialist Protection Command, a unit more accustomed to securing palaces and persons than serving search warrants. Their leader was Major James Thorne, a man in his late 40s with a face that was all planes and angles, and eyes that missed nothing. He held a rolled document, its official seals a stark contrast to the sleepy atmosphere. The front door of the estate opened before Thorne could raise the heavy brass knocker. A man in his 60s, the butler Hargreaves, stood ramrod straight, his expression a masterpiece of polite inquiry that barely masked profound alarm. "May I help you, sir?" "Major James Thorne, Royal Guard. We have a warrant to search these premises, issued under the Official Secrets Act and the authority of the Crown Private Estate Office." Thorne's voice was calm, devoid of aggression, but absolute in its authority. He presented the document. "We are here to recover specific items of royal property. I must ask you to secure the household and gather all residents in one room." Inside her second-floor sitting room, Camilla Rosemont had been watching since the first car appeared. She wore a silk robe over her nightdress, her famously vibrant auburn hair, now more silver than red, pulled into a loose knot. She did not look surprised. Instead, a weary resignation settled on her fine-boned features, followed by a flash of defiance. Her fingers found the small, worn velvet pouch she had tucked into her pocket, the shapes within hard and familiar. She gave the scene below one last, lingering look before turning away from the window. Downstairs, the operation unfolded with quiet precision. Guardsmen, now gloved, moved with a respectful but relentless efficiency. They began in the ground-floor reception rooms, their movements methodical. Thorne made his way to the drawing room, where Hargreaves had gathered a handful of sleepy and terrified staff. The major's attention was immediately drawn to the walls. They were a gallery to a past life, photographs of a younger, radiant Camilla with royalty, with diplomats, at glittering events. Prominently, in a silver frame, was a picture of Camilla and the late queen, arms linked, laughing on the grounds of Balmoral. They looked like sisters or the dearest of friends. Thorne was studying this photograph when Camilla entered. She had dressed hastily in a tweed skirt and sweater, an attempt at normalcy that couldn't conceal the tension in her frame. "Major," she said, her voice cool, "you've made quite an entrance. May I offer your team some tea? They look as though they could use it." "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Rosemont," Thorne replied, turning to face her. He noted the proud set of her jaw, the intelligent eyes assessing him. This was not a woman who would be easily intimidated. "You know why we are here." "I can guess," she said, moving to the fireplace, putting a barrier of antique furniture between them. "You're here about the Queen's things. The jewelry, everyone said, was lost." "Not lost," Thorne corrected gently. "Misappropriated. Removed from royal custody without consent following her late Majesty's passing." A faint, sad smile touched Camilla's lips. "Is that what the record says? How very official." She glanced at the photograph. She was my friend, Major. Long before she was your queen. What passes between friends is not always for the record. Thorne sensed the profound story buried beneath her words, but his duty was clear. The warrant specifies a diamond and sapphire necklace, a pair of matching earrings, and an emerald bracelet. All part of the private collection, never willed to any individual. Their disappearance has been a matter of internal investigation for years. Recent intelligence led us here. Camilla said nothing. She merely watched as two guardsmen, under the direction of a sharp-eyed female sergeant named Lynn, began to examine the room's ornate desk. The search was on. For hours, the estate was turned inside out with a courtesy that did nothing to diminish its invasiveness. Books were lifted from shelves, drawers were opened, floorboards were tapped. Thorne observed it all, but he also observed Camilla. She sat in the drawing room, sipping the tea she had insisted on making herself, her gaze distant. She showed flashes of irritation when a particularly delicate objet d'art was handled, but no panic. It was the calm of someone who had long anticipated this storm. As the morning wore on with no discovery, Thorne felt a flicker of doubt. The intelligence from the palace archivist had been specific. The jewels were here. Yet the estate, though large, was yielding nothing. He saw Sergeant Lynn return from the library, giving a slight, frustrated shake of her head. It was then that Camilla rose. "You're looking in the wrong places, Major," she said, her voice suddenly old and tired. "You're looking for treasure. But some treasures are kept close, not for their value, but for their weight." She met his gaze. "I have what you seek. It's not in a safe or a hidden compartment. It's in my bedroom." A stunned silence filled the room. Thorne nodded to Sergeant Lynn, who fell into step behind Camilla as she led the way upstairs, Thorne following. The procession felt ceremonial, funereal. Her bedroom was a surprisingly simple space, dominated by a large window overlooking the gardens. It was a room of memories, not ostentation. Without ceremony, Camilla walked to her dressing table, an elegant but unexceptional piece of furniture. She opened a small, inlaid wooden jewelry box that sat in plain view. From within, she did not retrieve a glittering piece, but the same worn velvet pouch. She loosened its drawstring and poured the contents onto the polished wood. Light exploded in the room. The late queen's sapphires, deep as a midnight ocean, caught the morning sun alongside diamonds that burned with a cold, pure fire. The emeralds were vivid green tears. They were breathtaking, lying absurdly on the chipped veneer of a dressing table. "Here," Camilla said, her voice barely a whisper. "You found them." Thorne approached, Sergeant Lynn beside him. He didn't reach for them immediately. "They were in your jewelry box?" "Unsecured. Where else would a woman keep her most precious things?" Camilla replied, her eyes fixed on the gems. "They were a promise, Major. A promise I have kept, and a burden I have carried every single day since she died." Document 2: The recovery of the jewels, lying so innocently on Camilla Rosemont's dressing table, was not the triumphant conclusion Major Thorne had expected. It was an anticlimax steeped in profound, unspoken history. As Sergeant Lynn, with gloved hands and meticulous care, catalogued each piece, the sapphire necklace with its central pear-shaped diamond, the teardrop earrings, the emerald bracelet woven like a ribbon of green fire, Thorne felt not like an investigator who had solved a case, but an intruder who had stumbled upon a sacred altar. Camilla watched the process, her arms wrapped around herself as if against a chill. The defiance had bled away, leaving only a deep, resonant sorrow. "She gave them to me," Camilla said, breaking the silence that was punctuated only by the click of Lynn's camera. "The week before she died. It was at the private house, at Woodside. Just the two of us. No aides, no secretaries." Thorne, against his training, did not interrupt. He gave a slight nod for her to continue. "She was very ill, though the world didn't know the half of it." Camilla's gaze was fixed on a middle distance, seeing a different room, a different time. She said to me, "Camilla, these have always suited your eyes." A typical thing for her to say, making a grand gesture sound like a simple observation. A tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. I refused, of course. I said they belonged to the royal collection, to history. She took my hand. Her hands were so thin by then. She said, "History will get what it needs. I need to know they are safe with someone who sees them as I did. Not as crown property, but as memories. Keep them safe for me, until the noise dies down." Thorne absorbed this. It was a personal bequest, but utterly unofficial and legally meaningless against the strict protocols governing the royal estate. "Why not come forward? After the mourning period?" A private gift could have been regularized. Camilla laughed, a short, bitter sound. Regularized? By the men in gray suits? The same men who spent 40 years trying to decide if I was a suitable friend for her? Who briefed against me in the press? They would have taken them, locked them in a vault, and written a memo stating I had relinquished them. They would have erased her last, personal wish to protect their idea of the institution. I couldn't let that happen, so I kept my promise. I kept them safe. Downstairs, the raid team was packing up, the mood shifting from tense anticipation to confused completion. The jewels were found. The mission was over. But Thorne felt the ground shifting beneath him. The clear narrative of theft and recovery was muddied by this testimony of friendship and a deathbed promise. He instructed Sergeant Lynn to finish the inventory and secure the jewels in a protective case. He then asked Camilla, politely but firmly, to accompany him to the library. They needed to talk, and he needed a statement. In the book-lined quiet of the library, with the smell of old paper and beeswax, Camilla seemed to shrink. The adrenaline was fading. Thorne did not turn on a recorder immediately. He sat opposite her. Mrs. Rosemont, you understand the position this puts me in. I have recovered property of the Crown. Your explanation, while heartfelt, does not change the legal reality. I know the law, Major, she said wearily. But there is a higher law of the heart. She was the Queen, yes. But, to me, she was Elizabeth. My clever, funny, stubborn friend who loved her dogs and terrible television and who hated the fuss. The woman who gave me those, she gestured vaguely upstairs, was Elizabeth, not Her Majesty. She was entrusting her friend with a piece of her soul, not her registrar with an asset. Then why now? Thorne pressed, leaning forward. Our intelligence was recent. Something triggered this. Camilla looked away, towards the window where the mist was finally burning off. I am 74. My health is not what it was. I have no children. I have a nephew, greedy and distant. I began to worry, what would happen to them when I was gone? They'd be sold at some tawdry auction, her most private gift becoming a billionaire's trophy. The thought was unbearable. So, 3 months ago, I made discreet inquiries through an old, trusted solicitor. A hypothetical question about the legal status of gifts from a sovereign. It was a mistake. The palace has ears everywhere, especially when it comes to missing jewels. Thorne understood. Her attempt to find a legitimate, posthumous solution had been the trigger. The very system she distrusted had pinpointed her. I will need a full statement, he said, his voice softer now. And we will have to take the jewels. You understand that? I do, she nodded, a profound grief in the motion. But, will you understand, Major, that you are not taking evidence? You are taking a chapter of a life. You are taking her last touch. At that moment, Sergeant Lynn entered, holding the sealed case. All secured, sir. Camilla stood, her dignity returning like a cloak. Before you go, Major, one thing. In all your searching, you looked for the valuable, the shiny. Did anyone think to look for the note? Thorne froze. Note, the one she gave me with them, Camilla said, a trace of her old spirit returning. It's in the frame. The one with the photograph of us at Balmoral. Thorne and Lynn exchanged a glance. They returned to the drawing room. Carefully, Thorne lifted the heavy silver frame from the wall. On the back, the thick paper backing was sealed with brittle, yellowing tape. With a penknife, he carefully slit it. A single sheet of crested notepaper, folded once, slipped out. The handwriting was elegant, unmistakably familiar from 1,000 official documents. But here it was looser, more personal. My dearest Camilla, these are for you. A thank you for a lifetime of laughter and truth, away from the glare. Keep them, wear them, remember our adventures. Let them sparkle for us both. Always your friend, E. Thorne held the paper, feeling its weight. This changed everything, and yet, legally, it changed nothing. It was a personal note, not a deed of gift. But it was the truth. He looked at Camilla, who was watching him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. This will go with the jewels, he said. It will be part of the record. Thank you, she whispered. As the convoy prepared to leave, Thorne made a decision. He walked back to Camilla, who stood in the doorway of her home, looking suddenly, very alone. The process will be formal, he said. There will be inquiries. But I will see that this note is included in my report. I will state the context as you have given it. It was a small mercy, but her eyes showed she understood its significance. You're a good man, Major. You see more than just your orders. He gave a curt nod and turned to leave. As his car pulled away, he looked back. She was still there, a solitary figure in the doorway of the grand, lonely house. The jewels were in the case besides Sergeant Lynn, but Thorne felt the true weight of what they had taken was left behind, hanging in the misty Dorset air around Camilla Rosemont. His job was done, but the story, he knew, was far from over. Document 3: The return to London was a somber affair, conducted in near silence within the armored vehicle. The case containing the jewels and the fragile note sat on the seat between Major Thorne and Sergeant Lynn, a tangible presence that seemed to radiate the emotional charge of the morning. The clean, binary mission, raid, recover, return, now felt muddied, ethically complex. At the private, secure facility within the Crown Estate headquarters, the handover was a study in bureaucratic contrast. The receiving officer, a Mr. Aldrich from the Lord Chamberlain's office, was a man of paper and procedure. His eyes, behind rimless glasses, lit up at the sight of the jewels as Lynn placed them on a black velvet tray under harsh fluorescent lights. He examined them with a jeweler's loupe, checking them against old catalog photographs, murmuring codes and inventory numbers into a recorder. The sapphire and diamond necklace, LC number 4478, appears intact, he stated, his voice dry as dust. The emerald bracelet, LC 5121. Excellent. Thorne watched, feeling a wave of distaste. To Aldrich, these were assets, numbers in a ledger finally balanced. The human story behind them was irrelevant noise. There is also this, sir, Thorne said, interrupting the clinical inventory. He placed the framed photograph and the folded note, now in a clear evidence sleeve, on the table beside the tray. Aldrich paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he peered at the note through the plastic. He read it, his expression not changing. A personal correspondence, he said, as if diagnosing a mild illness. It will be archived with the relevant papers, of course, though its provenance and bearing on the matter are personal. It is the provenance, Mr. Aldrich, Thorne said, his voice tight. It explains why Mrs. Rosemont had the jewels. It was a personal gift from her late majesty. Aldrich gave a thin, dismissive smile. A kind sentiment, Major. But a sovereign's personal property, especially items of such historic and monetary value, cannot be alienated by a private note. There are channels, deeds, instruments. This, he tapped the plastic sleeve with a finger, is a memento. It does not constitute legal transfer. The items were, and have always remained, property of the Crown private estate. Their removal was an irregularity. Their recovery corrects that. Thorne felt a cold anger settle in his gut. He thought of Camilla's face, the weight of her promise. She believed she was following a queen's command. And we are following the law and the established protocols of the monarchy. Aldrich replied, his tone final. Your report, Major, should stick to the operational facts, execution of the warrant, location, and condition of recovered items. The emotional context is not germane to the official record. It can, in fact, be problematic. The meeting was over. Thorne was dismissed. As he walked the sterile, carpeted corridors, the victory of the recovery tasted like ash. He was a soldier, a man who followed orders and believed in the structures he served. But, for the first time, he saw how those structures could grind down a simple, human truth into bureaucratic powder. Back in his sparse office, he began drafting his report. He stared at the blank screen. He thought of writing exactly what Aldrich wanted, a dry, factual account. But the image of the note, of the two women laughing in the Balmoral photo, wouldn't leave him. He thought of Camilla's words. You see more than just your orders. Meanwhile, at the Rosemont estate, the aftermath of the raid settled like a fine, disorienting dust. The staff moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Camilla retreated to her sitting room, the absence of the velvet pouch in her jewelry box a physical hollow she felt with every breath. She felt unmoored. The promise that had anchored her for over a decade was gone, taken away in a sealed case. Her solicitor, a man named Edward Graves who had handled her affairs for 30 years, arrived in the afternoon, his face grave. Camilla, this is very serious. They could press charges. Misappropriation, even theft of royal property. The press, if they get a whiff of this, let them, Camilla said. But her voice lacked conviction. She was tired. The truth is in that note, Edward. The truth is what a court would define it as, Graves replied gently. And a court would look at protocol, not friendship. We must prepare a defense. We need to demonstrate you had no intent to permanently deprive, that you acted out of a sense of personal obligation. The note helps, but it is not a legal shield. The world, in the form of law and public opinion, was closing in. The private pact between two friends was being forced into a public, legal framework where it did not fit. That evening, Thorne made a call. It was to a retired palace archivist, a woman named Margaret Peg Sterling, who had worked for the late Queen for 40 years and was known for her discretion and her formidable memory. He met her in a quiet London park. "Peg, I need context," he said, after explaining the situation in broad strokes, omitting names and specifics. "A gift from Her late Majesty to a close friend just before she died. Private, unwitnessed. Jewels from the private collection." Peg, a small woman with bright, bird-like eyes, looked at him shrewdly. "You're talking about Camilla Rosemont and the Balmoral Parure," she said without hesitation. Thorne was stunned. "You knew?" "I suspected. I wasn't there, but I knew the Queen's mind. She loved Camilla like a sister. They had a friendship that existed outside the cage. The official collection, it was a duty to her. But those pieces, the sapphires and the emeralds, she wore them often in private, at Woodside, with Mrs. Rosemont. They were her jewels, in the personal sense." Peg sighed. "When they were listed as missing after her death, I had a feeling. I never said anything. Some truths are too fragile for paperwork." "The man from the Lord Chamberlain's office called them irregularities," Thorne said. Peg's face hardened. "Aldrich, a clerk. He understands inventory, not legacy. The Queen had the right to give a personal gift. The irregularity is the system's failure to accommodate a sovereign's final, private act of friendship." Thorne left the meeting with Peg's words ringing in his ears. The official path was clear: file his report, close the case. But an unofficial truth, held by a retired archivist and a grieving friend, painted a different picture. He was at a crossroads between duty to the institution and duty to a deeper, more human truth. Back at his desk, he opened his report file. He deleted the sterile opening line he had written. He began again. "This operation recovered physical assets, but its core is a matter of personal faith versus procedural protocol." He knew this report would be rejected, would likely anger his superiors. But he typed through the night, weaving together the raid, Camilla's testimony, the note, and Peg Sterling's corroborating insight. He wasn't just filing a recovery report. He was writing a testament to a promise. He had no idea if it would make any difference. But, for his own conscience, it was the only thing he could do. The raid had ended, but the battle for the story of the jewels had just begun. Document 4 Major Thorne's report landed like a grenade in the placid waters of the Crown Estate Office. Its deviation from the standard, emotionless format, its insistence on framing the recovery within the context of a deathbed promise and a lifelong friendship, triggered immediate consternation. He was summoned to a meeting not with Mr. Aldrich, but with Aldrich's superior, the assistant comptroller of the Lord Chamberlain's office, a man named Sir Nigel Chesworth. Sir Nigel's office was a monument to tradition, all dark wood, and portraits of monarchs past. He did not invite Thorne to sit. "Major, your report is novel," Sir Nigel began, steepling his fingers. "It reads more like a romantic biography than an operational summary. We are not in the business of curating sentimental narratives. We are in the business of safeguarding royal property." "With respect, Sir Nigel," Thorne said, standing at attention, "the narrative is the key to the operation. Understanding why Mrs. Rosemont acted as she did is relevant to the case's disposition and potentially to any legal proceedings. The why is irrelevant," Sir Nigel stated flatly. "The what is clear. Items were removed without authorization. Your job was to retrieve them. You have done so. The inclusion of hearsay and personal correspondence serves only to cloud the issue and create potential for embarrassing publicity." He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk. "This is the approved statement. You will resubmit your report mirroring these facts, and only these facts. The note will be sealed in the private archive, accessible only by royal command. The matter is closed." Thorne looked at the bland, 3-paragraph summary. It erased Camilla, erased the Queen's personal wish, erased everything but the bureaucratic truth. He felt a stiffening in his spine. "I cannot in good conscience submit that as a full account, sir. It omits material facts." Sir Nigel's eyes turned cold. "Your conscience, Major, is not the guiding principle here. The monarchy is. We survive by consistency, by rules that outlive individuals. A sovereign's whims, even dying ones, cannot be allowed to destabilize the integrity of the collection. Imagine the precedent. This is not about two old friends. It is about the institution for the next 100 years. You will comply, or I will have you reassigned to a post where your literary aspirations will be of less consequence. Do I make myself clear? The threat was unambiguous. Thorne was a career soldier. Disobedience meant the end of everything he had worked for. Perfectly clear, sir. He left the office, the approved statement in hand, feeling a profound sense of defeat. He had tried to bridge the gap between the human heart and the institutional machine, and the machine had crushed him without a second thought. Meanwhile, in Dorset, Camilla's world was also contracting. Her solicitor, Edward Graves, had received a formal letter from the Crown's lawyers. It stopped short of threatening prosecution, but it was a stark, legalistic document that referred to the unauthorized retention of property and demanded a full, signed statement from Camilla admitting the facts of the removal, with an undertaking never to discuss the matter publicly. In return, no further action would be taken. It's a gag order, Camilla, Graves said, his face grim. They want your silence in exchange for letting this go. They're terrified of the story getting out. Camilla felt a surge of anger, burning away the grief. They want me to reduce a lifetime of friendship to an admission of guilt? To say I stole from her? They want control of the narrative. They are offering you a way out without a scandal. If you refuse, he left the sentence hanging. The pressure was immense. The private trauma of the raid was now morphing into a public threat. She imagined the headlines: socialite held Queen's jewels in secret raid. Her friend's memory would be tarnished by association. The beautiful, private gesture turned into a sordid tale of theft. It was the very outcome she had kept the jewels for over a decade to avoid. That night, she didn't sleep. She wandered the empty halls of the estate, past the blank space on the wall where the Balmoral photograph had hung. She felt the ghost of her friend's presence, the echo of her laughter. She thought of the note. Let them sparkle for us both. They were in a vault now, in the dark. The promise felt broken. In London, Thorne faced his own night of reckoning. He sat at his kitchen table, the anodyne statement before him. He thought of Sir Nigel's words, the institution for the next 100 years. He believed in the institution. But he also believed that institutions were made of people, and that their humanity was their strength, not a weakness to be purged. To erase the Queen's final act of personal kindness, to criminalize Camilla's faithful promise, felt like a betrayal of the very spirit he was sworn to protect. He made a decision. He would not resubmit the false report. He would take the reassignment, the end of his trajectory in the elite unit. But, before he did, he would ensure one copy of his original, unvarnished report existed outside the system. He printed it, along with scanned copies of the note and the photograph. He placed it in a plain envelope. He didn't know what he would do with it, but he couldn't let the truth be erased. The next morning, two simultaneous actions were set in motion. Camilla, after a tearful but resolute conversation with Edward Graves, instructed him to reject the Crown's offer of a gag order. I will not sign a lie, she said. I kept a promise. If they want to prosecute an old woman for that, let them. The world should know what she wanted. And Thorne, having submitted his formal refusal to amend his report, was called into Sir Nigel's office to receive his temporary reassignment to a desk job in a records department, a professional exile. As he was clearing his desk, Sergeant Lynn approached. She had heard the rumors. Sir, it's wrong what they're doing, she said quietly, her loyalty to her commander warring with her fear. That note, it was real. I know, Sergeant, Thorne said. Sometimes doing the right thing for the long term means a short-term defeat. Keep your head down. But the story was escaping its confines. A diligent court reporter, catching wind of an unusual, sealed hearing being scheduled in the privacy of the Royal Courts of Justice, a hearing about the Rosemont case, began to ask questions. A cleaner at the Crown Estate Office, who had overheard raised voices about a major and some jewels, mentioned it to a cousin who worked for a tabloid. The first, faint tremors of a media earthquake were beginning. The institution wanted silence, but the human truth, sharp and compelling, was pressing against the seams, demanding to be told. The raid had recovered the jewels, but it had unleashed a force far harder to control, a story of love, loyalty, and a system that had no place for either. Document 5. The storm broke not with a single thunderclap, but with a persistent, drizzling leak. The tabloid, tipped by the cleaner's cousin, ran a cryptic but tantalizing piece: Palace Jewel Mystery, Raid on Dorset Estate. It lacked names and specifics, but it pulsed with implied scandal. This triggered a chain reaction. Other papers, digging through property records and social registries, quickly identified the Dorset estate as belonging to Camilla Rosemont, a known intimate of the late queen. The connection was explosive. At the same time, the Crown's legal strategy hit an unexpected snag. The judge assigned to the preliminary hearing, a venerable man named Justice Atherton, known for his old-world manners and unshakable integrity, requested to see all materials, including Major Thorne's original, suppressed report, and the note. Sir Nigel's office attempted to argue executive privilege, but Justice Atherton, in his quiet, firm way, insisted, if this is to be adjudicated, even in private, the court must be in possession of all facts, not a curated selection. Faced with a media frenzy and a judiciary unwilling to be a rubber stamp, the institution began to fracture. A senior member of the royal household, a longtime private secretary to the late queen who had stayed on in an advisory role, got wind of the note's existence and Thorne's report. Shocked by the heavy-handed attempt to erase the queen's clear personal intent, he made a discreet but furious call to the Lord Chamberlain himself. In Dorset, Camilla was under siege. Reporters camped at her gates. She refused to speak to them, but she also refused to hide. She took walks in her walled garden, visible but silent, a picture of dignified resilience. Her rejection of the gag order now looked less like defiance and more like principle. Public sympathy, fueled by images of the elegant, elderly woman facing down the palace legal machine, began to tilt in her favor. Major Thorne, languishing in his records department purgatory, was summoned unexpectedly, not by Sir Nigel, but by the same senior royal advisor. In a confidential meeting, Thorne was asked to tell the whole story, from the Misty Dawn raid to the pressure to rewrite history. He did so, without embellishment. The Queen, the advisor said sadly, would be appalled. She hated bullies, and she loved Camilla. This was meant to be a kindness, not a crisis. Back in the justice's chambers, the atmosphere had shifted. Justice Atherton had read Thorne's report and held the note in his hands. He looked at the Crown's lawyers and at Edward Graves, representing Camilla. This is not a case of theft, he said, his voice dry but firm. This is a case of an executor failing to understand a testator's wishes. The note from Her late Majesty is unequivocal in its personal sentiment. While it does not carry legal weight as a deed of gift, it profoundly changes the moral character of Mrs. Rosemont's possession. To criminalize her actions would be a travesty. He proposed a solution, a formal, private mediation, not a court case. The jewels would remain with the Crown. Their legal status was unambiguous. But their history would be officially amended. The note would be placed with them in their permanent archive, ensuring the story of their final gift traveled with them forever. A private statement would be issued, acknowledging the personal circumstances of their temporary removal and expressing gratitude for their safekeeping. No admission of guilt from Camilla. No prosecution. It was a Solomonic compromise. The Crown retained the assets and avoided an ugly public trial. Camilla's name was cleared, and her friend's wish was formally recognized in the record. The institution bent, just enough, to accommodate the human truth. The agreement was signed in a quiet room at the royal courts. Camilla, looking frail but triumphant, signed her name. Major Thorne was present as a witness. As the papers were exchanged, Sir Nigel, his face a mask of stiff disapproval, gave a curt nod. The system had conceded, not out of grace, but out of necessity. A week later, a small, sealed case was delivered by secure courier to the Rosemont estate. It was not the jewels. It was the Balmoral photograph in its frame, and a beautifully made, archival-quality facsimile of the Queen's note, with a letter from the Royal Collection Trust stating that the original now resided with the jewels, as per the mediated agreement. A permanent link. Camilla placed the photograph back on its hook. She held the facsimile note, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. She smiled, a real smile for the first time in months. The promise was fulfilled, and now acknowledged. For Major Thorne, the consequences were mixed. He was not welcomed back to his old unit with open arms. The institution has a long memory for those who challenge it. But he was offered a new role, one suggested by the senior advisor, a liaison position between the Royal Guard and the Royal Collection, focusing on the security and history of significant items. It was a recognition that understanding the stories behind the objects was part of protecting them. The public story faded quickly. The papers moved on. But within the hallowed halls of the archive, a small revolution had occurred. The sapphires, diamonds, and emeralds now rested in their climate-controlled drawer with a new catalog entry. It listed their dimensions, their weight, their provenance. And, at the end, Under additional context, it read, bequeathed in friendship by Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II to Mrs. Camilla Rosemont in a private capacity, September 2022. See accompanying personal correspondence. The raid had recovered the lost jewelry. But, in the end, it had recovered something more fragile and more valuable, a testament to a friendship that transcended crown and protocol, a truth that was no longer hidden, but now sparkled quietly in the light of history, forever part of the record.